What was or is Aristotle's categories? If you've heard of Aristotle before, you know that he's a significant player in the history of philosophy, history of science, really just a key player. He was a disciple of Plato. He ran the not the London, the Athenian Lyceum, and he not invented, he created a number of philosophical and scientific categories that many people used for centuries. Some of his ideas have fallen out of vogue, maybe sometimes in the 1800s that became true. Interestingly enough, though, his views are coming back in vogue again, especially his four causes. Something that I'm not talking about today, but I'm talking about his categories, the 10 categories that aim to be able to explain or describe all sorts of things in the world around us. So Aristotle, 384, 322 BC, famous philosopher. In this talk, or in this little video, I just want to describe what the categories are, give you some context for some of the ancient criticism of these categories, and help you to situate Aristotle in his time and place, and to kind of understand maybe some of the debates that later people created around his categories. So in essence, he says when you're just talking about things themselves, like just a word itself, like man, this horse, that man, or color, whatever. There are a number of things you can say, and he is categorized 10 categories you can say of something. So he says of things said without any combination, just a word by itself, each signifies either one, substance, or quantity, or qualification, or a relative, or where, or when, or being in a position, or having, or doing, or being affected. So basically you have substance, which is the underlying subject, the underlying thing, and you can describe this substance by using words of quantity, 2, 4, 5, whatever. Qualification, describe the quality. Relative, the son of a father, the father of a son, 10 meters away from this thing, etc. Where it is it in the in the ground, in the sky? When it is, which is obvious. What position it is? Are you lying down, standing up? Having, do you have, I don't know, a dog in your hands? That might not be the right way to think about having. Anyways, doing, which is an action, or being affected, which is having something happen to you. So these 10 categories, substance stands in special place since it describes a persistent subject, which Aristotle calls prime substance. By contrast, secondary substance refers to the substance's species and genus. For example, in the prime substance, this man, that's the prime substance, but what species is this man? Well, the species of man, and man is a species that is under the genus of animal. So obviously, under the genus of animal, you could have fish, which is a species, and under fish, you could have trout. It's a way of categorizing things. This man, the primary substance, may be in a city, that's the where, while having a sword in his hand, which is just a way to use these 10 categories to talk about everyday experience, everyday description. And it's a way to just simplify language and have a way to talk, we might say today, scientifically. It's a sort of grammar of science, a grammar of philosophy, to be able to know exactly what each person is talking about and what they mean by their words. And in a time before Google, where you could just, what does this person mean by this word? It was useful, I think, in the ancient world to have a common set of definitions and words to describe a common philosophical, scientific perspective on the world. It helped knowledge be transferred. So that's the kind of thing that he's doing here. One way that Aristotle's categories became controversial was his view of the relationship between primary substance and secondary substance. So primary substance, this man, this trout, this fish, whatever, is what Aristotle would say is the most substantial thing. And when it comes to species and genus, they're kind of these bigger categories, and they are, he might say, maybe less substantial, or they're a little further away from the main thing. In fact, they wouldn't even really exist unless the primary substance does. So he says in his categories, so if the primary substances did not exist, it would be impossible for any of the other things to exist. So genus or genera, species, these would not exist if not for the primary substance. It seems like is what he's saying. And a little later he concludes that substances as primary subjects are substances most of all. So if you don't have any particular this man, this fish, this computer, whatever, then there's no need to create a species or genus for them. They're sort of secondary to it, which means these universal or bigger categories of genus and species like man and animal are posterior to the primary substance. Now this is pretty reasonable. Like if you just have a bunch of things in the world, then you abstract from the things that you see in the world categories to describe them, like species or genus. We do this all the time. But it suggests something interesting. It suggests that Aristotle is going against Plato, who said that the universal categories of the forms were prior to the particular substances in the world. There is a priority of nature where the form is prior to in importance and so on, and makes sense of the individual things in the world, where Aristotle seems to say that they are posterior to the individual things of the world, the prime substances. So is this a contradiction? Is Aristotle fighting his mentor Plato, his former teacher rather? Well, that's a big question, but for many people today, the answer would just be yes. Plato believed in forms that were, external to him, that you could access through soul or mind, where Aristotle, many people say, had a hylomorphic point of view, where the forms and the material things were in the objects themselves, and there's no need necessarily to posit this kind of more complicated Platonic view of forms being prior to all the things that we experience in life. However, this isn't how all the ancient interpreters of Aristotle thought that he communicated. For example, Porphyry, who is in the 200s, the AD 200s, he argues that Aristotle's categories refer specifically to logical arguments. He's not really talking about being as such. It's not the genera of being. The title is the categories. Categories are logical predication, logical speech about things based on how we experience everyday life. And so it's obvious that if you have 10 books on your bookshelf, and there's this book, that book, this book, that book, then you're going to say they belong to the species of book, maybe to the genus of communication or something like that. And that's just how that works. Those are abstractions. They're not real things. It's just the way that we communicate work. We create abstractions that are not necessarily identical to Plato's forms, and that's really what Aristotle is talking about. Further, he says that if you look at Aristotle's work in internal argument, there's not really any kind of contradiction with Plato. They're pretty similar. There might be some shades different here because they're different people, but they're really saying the same thing. Stephen Strange, who has a bit of a comment on Porphyry, argues this way. He says Aristotle calls particular substances primary substances in the categories, according to Porphyry, because he is there discussing the classification of significant expressions, and these apply primarily to sensible individuals, and only secondarily to the abstracted universals that are predicated of them. For the primary purpose of language is to communicate about ordinary things and their individual properties. Abstracted universals, for Porphyry, unlike the real universals, the Platonic forms, have a merely conceptual existence, and are indeed posterior to sensible things. In other words, Porphyry sees Aristotle as talking about abstractions like this trout is a fish, species, an animal, genus. It's not really per se talking about the form of fish or whatever. Aristotle's talking in the more common sense way. They're just basic abstractions for how we think. We just see objects in the world around us and we make categories for them. We're not really thinking about these eternal forms, these unified things behind reality. These abstractions are posterior to sensible things. By contrast, Platonic forms remain prior to sensible things. This is what Porphyry thinks that Aristotle is open to and maybe even affirms. Strange notes, thus Aristotelian abstractable universals that are the reference of general terms can be included in our ontology alongside the Platonic forms. They are immanent universals. The forms are transcendent universals. and the causes of both sensibles and of immanent universals. So you have forms that cause all the sensible things that you can access with your senses, and also with the abstractions that our senses form. Whether those abstractions are real or not, they're not real forms. They're just, in our mind, we might say, just to organize the world around us. And it's possible that Porphyry is not too far afield here, because if you look at the posterior analytics of Aristotle in 1.2, it does seem to argue that those sort of unverifiable truths, undemonstrable hypotheses, whatever the language you use, I can't remember offhand, these universal things that you use for deduction, they actually precede sensible objects in the order of nature and in the order of relation to us. And so it seems like Aristotle there is talking about something like universals, like the forms, not exactly perhaps, but that they are prior to our ability to use deduction, not posterior to afterwards. And so even in Aristotle's own writings, you have the capability to maybe see, maybe Porphyry's right. Maybe Aristotle in his categories isn't really talking about the genera of being, but rather sort of a genera of just mere categories, just the way that we talk logically. It belongs to the organon of logical discourse, not so much to the, metaphysical, categories of being and change and all that kind of stuff in the way that Aristotle will talk about in different places. On the other hand, Plotinus, in his Enneads, he ends up seeing there being another sort of conflict with Aristotle's categories. In fact, he says the tenfold categories of Aristotle don't really make sense. It's better to hold to the fivefold categories of Plato that he derives from the writings of Plato, which are being, motion, rest, identity, and difference. They're sort of the most simple ways to talk about things. There's being, and life is motion, and rest, I guess, is ceasing of life or motion, whatever. Identity and difference tells you if this is that thing or not that thing. Exactly. And these are the most kind of common ways to categorize the world. And he kind of thinks, well, Aristotle has lots of interesting things to say, but he's a little bit confusing. Like, do these categories only refer to physical entities? Are they only, kind of like Porphyry said, like this idea of just how we logically talk? Or can they refer to intellectual entities? Or are they just sort of metaphysical descriptions as well? Do they actually make sense? And Plotinus says maybe not. He thinks that the categories should really all kind of return to unity, and motion and rest describe the movement of life and substance. Identity and difference refer to the identity or difference of posterior things to being. This is kind of really basic categories, but the more safer ones, and then everything else after that, all the differentia after that, posterior to being, can be, described in the normal way. Obviously, he would have more of a Platonic view of forms and reality. In any case, however you want to describe Plotinus, he doesn't actually find Aristotle's categories to fit easily in his Neoplatonic philosophy, whereas Porphyry does. So there is a bit of an internal, you might say, difference among how Neoplatonic philosophers are thinking about Aristotle. But for the most part, Aristotle's 10 categories tend to kind of win out as I think as Porphyry says, as an introduction to, is it Porphyry? I might be thinking of someone else, but sort of an introduction to philosophy. And we use them throughout the centuries in the West, all over the world, really. They seem to be useful categories. No one's saying this is the be-all, end-all, but they are a good shake of how the world works. In the sciences, and in the metaphysical world as well, since theology often will use some of these categories because they're so common sense, like being affected, like having something happen to you. That's a category. So is that Aristotelian, or is that just common sense? Well, the answer is supposed to be yes. Aristotle is just naming common sense. Whenever we think about philosophy, and in particular ancient philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy and so on, it's not meant to be this confusing system that you can't understand. Plotinus is a little bit more like that. It's very mystical and out there. Later on, you'll have a change in Neoplatonism to be more of a religious kind of activity. But really, Aristotle he's just trying to say this is what the real world is, and this is how language works. It's common sense to say that someone can be in a location, can be at a certain point of time, could be doing something, could have something happen to them. These are the categories. And what he's not doing is creating some mystical philosophical system, but just saying, this is common sense. This is the best way that I can organize all the things we can do to describe anything that we encounter in reality, depending on your view of his categories. And that's what it is. And so, for my part, I'm completely fine with the categories. I think the controversy surrounding universal informs, either being prior to or posterior to kind of sensible experience, largely depends on whether or not you see Aristotle as a follower of Plato, or if you think that Aristotle is sort of a divergent character. If you think he's a follower of Plato, you'll look at the different textual cues across Aristotle, and you'll say these seeming contradictions can kind of be ironed out when you think, like Porphyry does, that Aristotle is merely talking about logical predication in categories, and elsewhere he's talking about more about the genera of being. And if you don't think he's a slavish follower of Plato, you might say, well, these are just kind of weird contradictions, but it's clear that Aristotle does not follow, that Plotinus does not follow Aristotle, and maybe we shouldn't either. Or, sorry, I'm saying this weirdly. Aristotle does not follow Plato, and he's, doing his own thing. Well, I don't really know if I have the answer to that question. I can just say, if you like the categories, to me, they're sort of just a common sense description of how things are. They're basically useful. For me, they help to organize my speech and my thoughts, but I'm not like beholden to them, and it's not a hill that I die on. Sort of like, I think gravity is a good explanation for why we're attracted to mass. Yeah, that makes the best sense from what I know. It's the best modern scientific way to describe things. 10 categories, to my mind, are maybe another useful way to logically describe things as well, and I'm a-okay with that insofar as I can't find a better argument. And really, after 2,000 years plus, I don't think we've really found a better way to talk than Aristotle's kind of common sense speech. So I'm okay maintaining it, despite the complaints by Plotinus. I'm okay with it. All that said, that's the end of today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you'd like to, or if you don't want to, do it anyways. I like subscriptions. Bye for now.